Hello, friends, and welcome to the City of the Immaculata, a channel where we discuss various topics of history and theology. If you enjoy these videos, please like, and if you haven't already, consider subscribing and sharing it with others. Thank you. Today's lecture is called The Road to 1054, a History. Just a quick reminder that this is part of a wider series of videos that we're doing on the channel. They're exclusive as of the recording of this video on our Patreon. That is our patreon.com/ City of the Immaculata channel. These videos include the ones that we've been discussing, the Road to 1054, and then we'll be moving on to the Azymes controversy, and then we'll be discussing Peter the Aleut. We'll follow that up by talking about Caesaropapism, and then we'll look at what I'm calling the making of modern orthodoxy, and finishing it up with orthodoxy as reactionism against the Catholic Church. So please stay tuned for those. So I decided to make it a two parts in this first in the series of lectures that we're doing. I did this because while the two topics are very much related, they are also their own unique problems, which I felt could go with being treated on separately. I would recommend before watching this one, certainly before watching the next ones, to finish the previous video before this, the Fight for the Land. Today we'll be covering the Fight for the Faith. Just some points to consider, and I brought this up in the last one, but I want to emphasize that this is not intended to be an apologetics work. Now, we are going to be getting a little bit deeper into some of the issues that are theological, that are theologically relevant to the schism. So it's going to lend itself more to sounding like I'm giving an apologetics critique of the Eastern Orthodox Church. But I try in this to be somewhat critical in my attempts at doing history here and trying to present both sides. I would also add that while the Great Schism is fascinating, my own interests are more around the trajectory of the West. In order to tell how we get there, this is an important event leading to the future, coming into the High Middle Ages, coming into the modern period. The schism with the Eastern Church and the ramifications around all of that are going to have long-standing consequences. We're going to be going up to the very moment of the mutual excommunications. We're not going to be reviewing their legality here. We're not going to be, there's been a lot written about who was responsible specifically for the events in the summer of 1054. We're not going to do that. It's been done a lot. I know this is super interesting to people for whatever reason, but I think you'll find this one helpful. And this is mainly going to be through the lens of the Gregorian reforms, to add that specific narrative so you can have that context as you're reviewing the events of this period. I do want to stress that you cannot truly separate the land disputes from the theological disputes, even though I have done that here. You could easily have some of the theological disputes that really never went anywhere had not serious problems of land conflicts not propelled or at least exacerbated the other disputes disproportionate to what they may have been at other times. So while these are two separate videos, I did that more for convenience than any kind of clear distinction for the people that lived through the events themselves. So I began by just kind of giving a quick recap of where we are, the trajectory of the papacy. On the left of your screen in yellow, I have what I would refer to as the Formosian conflict with the papacy of Pope Stephen the Sixth, or the Fifth, rather. I guess it depends on how you're counting. The issues with the Holy Roman Empire kind of got out of hand. There's some conflict with one of the men who work for the Roman Curia. His name is Formosus. Formosus himself ends up becoming pope, and there is a lot of factionalism that's starting to take place at this time. When Formosus dies, he has quite a few adherents and he has quite a few enemies. Well, with Stephen the Sixth coming after Formosus, Stephen the Sixth is basically in the pocket of the imperial powers, and so they actually exhume the body of Formosus, and this really kind of begins this trajectory towards this dark ages of the papacy, which some people would refer to as the pornocracy, but you have, at least here in the yellow, this sort of back and forth, mainly with pro-Formosian popes, but there's also the Stephen faction in there as well, and they're sort of battling with each other until finally there's a military general who comes to power in Rome named by Theophylact, and Theophylact has a very powerful wife, and they end up kind of taking the city. And so we'll be talking about that here in a little bit more, but that yellow there is this area that we call the Dark Ages. It's also known as the pornocracy. And then you lead to this period, which I would call the it's the period where the Holy Roman Empire is intervening again in the affairs of the papacy, and because there's just a lot of strife at this point in time, and this kind of walks us all the way up through the year 1048. I'm doing a very quick recap, as you can see. There's a lot of popes that come in this period, but these are sort of the three in this, in this little less than 200-year span of time here, what the kind of three overarching periods are. Now, if you ever wondered why the papacy is this uniquely independent bishopric, whereas, say, the patriarchs of the East or Protestants, for that matter, seem to be almost wholly tied to the secular powers, well, you have to really look no further than right here. Now, a lot of people begin with the reforms of the 11th century, but you kind of have to back up a little bit to make sense of even those. Now, there is, of course, the argument, one which I think is correct, that in theory, the bishop should always be distinct and autonomous from the state. And it would get too far afield, but the goal was never a complete and total separation, but rather a clear demarcation of the powers of the episcopate versus the powers of the princes. This is a conflict that's existed many times, in the East. They just never managed to break away from state control. Protestants sort of placed themselves back in the willingly placed themselves back into the protection of state powers, whereas Rome did manage to break away, and for, a significant period of its history moving forward, the overwhelming majority of it has managed to stay independent. Now, the so-called pornocracy period is really just a time when the Carolingian Empire has fragmented. The city's embroiled in its own internal conflicts, just as the empire sort of falls apart, and it's involved in its own conflicts as well. This alliance with the papacy that Charlemagne had created really just kind of dissolves. Charlemagne, who had been acting as something of a protectorate for the independence of the papal states and the papal office, well, that's all now gone. And as I was saying, General Theophylact, and his wife Theodora, and then subsequently their daughter Marozia and her husbands and lovers, they become the most powerful family in Rome, and it is they now who, quote unquote, protect the papacy. The problem is that they end up using the office more for nepotist advancement of their sons and grandsons rather than considerations of the holy institution that it's supposed to represent. And even more importantly, it kind of goes inward in many ways. Now, I want to be careful there because Rome was never completely insular, even during this time, even during this quote unquote dark ages. It was never out of the picture. She was still involved with events that were happening around Christendom. But regardless, it was a situation not unlike any other bishop where their appointment was based solely on the discretion of the local nobility, which in turn kind of made them more concerned with local rather than with sort of regional church-wide issues that Rome had historically been interested in. And this internal factionalism becomes more and more tenuous until it boils over into outright conflict between, say, Marozia and some of the other factions within the city. While all of that's happening, we also have a little reform movement that takes place, Cluniac reforms. Founded in the 10th century, it achieved its independence surprisingly by its association with the papacy, even though the papacy was during this Dark Ages. It was just kind of worked out because William of Aquitaine, writing the charter for the monastery, grants Cluny to the papacy, which, as we were saying, is sort of it's tied up with its own concerns. It's not really worried about what's a monastery in southern France is up to. They said, sure, we'll accept responsibility for Cluny, but what that did was it freed up the monastery, whereas unlike other monasteries of the age, which were all very homogenized and standardized in such a way that kind of brought them away from the original purpose of monastic life, Cluny was really able to focus itself on reform. Now, the reforms that it was primarily interested in were one in the liturgy. Cluny was famous for its liturgies. It made it central to their monastic life. In this, it was heavily focused on unifying the Roman liturgy across the European continent. It was very interested in lay investiture and would become even more so in later years, but even in this beginning here and with the rise of Cluny. And this is about the vesting of bishops by secular rulers. They're interested in the laxity that had grown around clerical incontinence, and most importantly, they are concerned with simony, the buying and selling of religious offices and goods. And you will find it fairly consistent down through the preceding centuries. This becomes the main areas of concern for the papacy in the High Middle Ages. This is very tied to the Gregorian reforms, all the way up through the all the various Lateran councils. These are the primary things that the papacy is going to be interested in. And the reason that this happens is because as the Cluny reforms grow in popularity, you more and more find prelates who are reform minded themselves, they are interested in seeing these reforms enacted as a wider church policy. And one such bishop is Bishop Bruno of Toul. So Bishop Bruno, he from a very early age was showing signs of sanctity in his life and manners and habits. He's consecrated in 1027. He becomes Bishop of Toul during a time of famine and war and political instability there, and he becomes known in this region and respected for his ability to broker peace as well as to manage just some of the unstable things that he's kind of dealing with. Famines and wars, you can imagine, especially in these periods, are just particularly damaging on the population and the people. So he gains a reputation and he is friendly toward the reforms that are taking place in Cluny. He's not a Cluny man himself, but he becomes known as a bishop that's friendly to the reforms that are happening there. Now, at the death of Pope Damasus II, the people of Rome request Bruno. There's a public, there's this public acclamation from the people of Rome, from the people of Rome themselves, mind you. This is even though he's in Toul, word had reached them of this holy bishop up there, and they said they wanted him. They wanted Bruno. Bruno makes clear, though, that he would only take the chair if, when he arrived to Rome, he hears for himself from the people their desire for him to be pope. So he walks barefoot and in beggar's clothes to Rome. And it's really an astonishing turn of events, one that I think few historians, even few church historians for that matter, really seem to appreciate. One of the reasons that he dons the pilgrim's clothes is because he wants word to travel before him that he's not going to be an imperial stooge. Unlike all that had been happening all the way back centuries before with Formosus and all of the things that had happened in the scandals around that, all of the scandals around the Theophylacty, all of the scandals around Holy Roman Emperor Otto II being involved to try to clean up some of the mess. He's making a clear signal here that I, Bruno, I, Bishop Bruno, come as a pilgrim, not as a man of the empire. He was coming as a servant of the servants. The time of captivity is over, is what he's saying. You guys are about to get that old-timey papacy back. As well, he takes the name of Leo, and this is another indication of his intent to be a reformer. Most importantly, though, I think, is that as he's making this journey, he's picking up other reform-minded men and convincing them to come with him to Rome and be a part of this historic moment. You know, he says, I need a few good men. So he doesn't just go right to Rome. He travels to various places. He stops by Cluny. He calls upon Hildebrand there, later to be Pope Gregory VII, to come with them. He brings Frederick of Lorraine, later Pope Stephen IX. He brings Archbishop Hallinard. He brings a man named Humbert. He brings Udo of Cluny. And these men are going to bring reform to the papacy. He doesn't, as I said, he doesn't come alone. He comes with a whole host of men that are all very much tied up around the reforms of the Cluniac monks. So Leo crosses the Alps. The standard of the time was for the Pope to enter Rome on horseback like a triumphant general. Leo enters in rags and barefoot. And the Roman people, they ate it up. I mean, they were ready for a change. When he gets there, this is getting towards the period when the papacy would no longer be elected by acclamation. The people are very much fickle, as you can imagine. And so, in an attempt to get the papacy away from imperial and secular control, they're eventually going to start the conclave and they're going to begin electing cardinals. But all of that's to come in the future. For now, he comes to the city. The Roman people see him. They see the holiness that he exudes, and they acclaim him pope. Now, I want to take some time to go through some of the timeline here because I think it's important for the context of where Leo is coming from and why it would be so consequential later. Now you'll notice he enters Rome winter of 1049, and he immediately sets about convening a series of synods to address primarily two things: the lax morals of the clergy and the issue of the selling of church offices. So we end up with synods in February 1049 of Easter. We have the synod in Rome. The issues there are going to be simony and clerical marriage. We have a summer synod in the Synod of Potvia. The issue is, again, simony and clerical marriage. October 1049, we have synods in Reims and Mans. The emperor presides in the one in Mans, and he helps to he's trying to integrate imperial support for the reform. The summer of 1050, there's a synod in Rome, and the issue there is going to be Berengar of Tours, who is going to be very consequential later in terms of the debates that are happening around the issue of the Eucharist, and as well, of course, simony and clerical marriage. Then we have the issue of the synods of Salerno and Siponto, issues there to strengthen the papal presence in southern Italy, especially against the Normans. And then as well, two archbishops are deposed for simony. And this is an important one to point out. These synods likely did come to the attention of the patriarch in Constantinople. A patriarch, mind you, that for some time now had been used to a sort of hands-off papacy, not too concerned. Now all of a sudden that you have a papacy in southern Italy, parts of which are were considered, the territory of the Byzantine Empire, and Constantinople was very aggressive at this time about its lands and its territories. So there are certain people I've read that want to make an issue about, well, maybe this is summer 1050, Leo's kind of, is he picking a fight here? Though I think it's important to point out that there's nothing that he's doing here that is really any different than what he would be doing in these other synods. There's nothing unique about Salerno and Siponto that like would stand out and make these any difference than the other ones. As well as he also had mutual support of many of the bishops and clergy and people of these dioceses when he was going around doing these synods. We're going to come back to that though. For now, let me see. We have the Synod of Vercelli, comes back around to Berengar of Tours, and then of course simony and marriage. Then there's another synod in Rome, simony and marriage, in the winter of 1052. The synod of Pressburg, Reisenberg, and Bamberg, simony and clerical marriages, and then attempts to bring Hungary in closer to Rome. And then finally in 1053, there's a synod in Rome, and at that point, the issue is going to be the Normans. So it's really a monumental thing, and I don't think you can overestimate the importance of this. Most of the time, when the popes came to take the chair of Peter, they kind of stayed around the chair of Peter. But I would like to, for a moment, just to kind of hone in on one of these synods, just to kind of give you an idea of what's going on around them. They become fairly uniform one to the next, how Leo goes about them. So I think, I just kind of picked the Synod of Reims here because we do have some good extant information on it. But the way that Leo goes about running them and the proceedings of them, the Pope comes in, he's there, he presides in the synod, he's present, which is important. He's kind of saying that not only are the boys back in town, but I'm here with them now too. So it's kind of a new thing to have the Pope of Rome traveling with these synods that are being formed. Now Reims in some ways exemplifies the uniqueness of it all. First of all, as I said, Leo presides over them. And then he comes to Reims October of 1049. He says he's going to hold a council. And Henry the First of France is a little bit angered over this being held without his calling it, without his, the princes of Europe at the time had kind of come accustomed to thinking that they were actually the heads of the church. And he orders a levy to sort of flex his own power. He says, I'm going to order a levy at the exact same time, levies which the bishops as subjects need to attend. So any bishop that attended the levy over Leo's synod, Leo deposes and excommunicates. It's several bishops, that are there. They Leo hears the complaints from clergy and from the people, and then he calls upon the bishops accused to come to Rome for further proceedings. Several bishops called upon don't comply, and they're deposed and excommunicated. So this is kind of, again, like I said, this is like the boys are back in town and we're not playing around. And that's why there's going to be such a strong reaction. Now, at certain points, you'll see complaints about particularly people that aren't fond of Rome, and the argument is here, well, they're going to take the other sides. Basically, like I'm against Rome in the year, I don't know, 1823 or 1956 or 2025. I'm against Rome. I turn back to these pages of history and I see some bishop from the Synod of Reims who's angry at the papacy at this moment in time. Well, yeah, yeah, they probably are kind of angry at the papacy at this kind of time. But the argument is, does the bishop actually have this kind of authority? And as far as I'm saying that because I think that's where actually the true argument lies. Now, whether or not that's kind of not here or there for this particular lecture, but I just want to point out that like this is one of the arguments that you'll hear against the papacy of this period of time, that it's exerting some kind of authority that it shouldn't have had. And the argument to that was, well, no, it was just reasserting its authority that it had kind of let lax, and other people stepped into that power vacuum, and then Rome came and reasserted its authority, and there was a lot of gnashing of teeth over the fact that Rome was doing this. But that doesn't just the fact that there was gnashing of teeth and people that weren't happy about it doesn't answer whether or not Rome had the authority to do it, which Rome had its own ways of establishing and proving that authority. Again, that's kind of a different conversation. But for now, so one of the accused, Bishop Hugh of Lagrace, flees and then goes back to Rome and seeks clemency. There are 13 canons that result from this synod, several of them dealing with simony and extortion. It's just an extraordinary victory for the papacy at this moment. The monarchy, the Henry I of France, he backs off. The bishop realizes that they don't have the upper hand here. There had been simony, those that were standing up in deposition against them and accusing them, like there had been simony, there had been instances of extortion, and now the tide of reform was too strong. The papacy was reforming, and those corrupting forces were unable to hold back the tide of reform. This event in Reims, took little over a week. And in 1 week, Rome had come and reasserted its authority. And it's kind of incredible when you think about it. So the question that kind of arises from all of this, one question that comes to my mind anyways, is should the episcopate be untethered from secular oversight? And if so, to what degree? Now, I'm not going to answer that here. It's would kind of take us too far afield from the road that to 1054 that I want to keep us on, but this is a subject that touches upon the Orthodox problem and the Protestant problem for that matter. The papacy at this moment, as I'm saying, she's breaking free from the secular interests that had held her, in some ways that had held Christianity since the days of Constantine. Early on, the church didn't have the kind of state leverage that she would have after the Constantinian and the Theodosian reforms and the Justinian reforms. So when we're looking at this, I don't care which group you are, whether you're Catholic or an Orthodox or a Protestant, we're all kind of looking back at the same early process when the faith emerges from underground. And we see that process kind of playing out over time and how the state and the religious powers would interact with one another. The Catholic West ends up going in one direction where the papacy and the bishops were not under at least the spiritual authority of the state. And in the East, it went in a very different direction. And so let's take a little bit of a closer look at that direction, the direction of the East. I think it's best to begin with a quick recap of where the Byzantine state is. And gosh, the the Byzantine emperors, it's like it's pretty wild with them. I stress that a lot, but it's just that's just how it is. I mean, you have some very high highs and some pretty some very low lows. Guys you're rooting for, and those guys that you're rooting for, unfortunately, more often than not, seem to lose out. And then guys that leave you thinking, "Holy cow, how is this going to end?" So the quarter century leading up to 1054 is one of relative instability in Byzantine terms. We start with Basil II, the Bulgar slayer, who I was speaking about in the last lecture. I mean, he leaves the empire significantly larger. It has engulfed the entire Bulgarian Empire, as well as there's contentious issues over the Kingdom of Croatia and Serbia. But he leaves the empire in a little bit of a chaotic, chaotic mess. I mean, the treasury's better off under him, and it may have been able to salvage it had not Constantine the Eighth been so administratively inept. And then you end up with third, and he's poisoned by the next Byzantine emperor, Michael the Fourth, who himself is an epileptic. Michael the Fifth, he's deposed, he's blinded. Blinding your opponent was a good way to keep him because the Byzantine Empire did not let blind men run the empire. So if you wanted to just really make sure that your guy wasn't going to be your opponent wasn't going to be emperor, you would blind them, and then they would get sent off to a monastery. So Michael the Fifth, he's sent to the monastery, and then Zoe and Theodora, they have a short reign until Zoe marries Constantine the Ninth, who is going to face all of these conflicts on multiple fronts of the empire, and he's sort of the man of the hour as we step into this period of 1054. Now, I do want to go through and spend a little bit of time on some of the Byzantine grievances with the Western Church. It's so easy to sort of isolate the issues of 1054 around 1054, but you have to realize that there's issues that stem that go way back to the beginning. In some ways, it goes at least goes back to the beginning when Constantine sent the capital to the east. And then, as we were saying last week, all of the sort of landed interests that you end up with, and you have sort of two capitals at that point who are naturally going to end up rivals of one another, even if they're supposedly, or not supposedly, even though they are in effect brothers. Brothers will rival with one another. So, just sort of a quick rundown here. I'm sure some of you guys are aware of some of these, anyways. You have the Council of Constantinople 381. Rome rejects Canon 3. You know, Canon 3 declared that the Bishop of Constantinople has a primacy of honor among the bishops, second only to the Bishop of Rome. He basically usurps the spot due to he says this is what the argument is at the council, that it's due to Constantinople being the quote unquote new Rome, another title that it liked to give to itself, placing it over Alexandria, and Constantinople is going to be resentful to Rome and Rome's sort of staunch opposition and rejection of this canon. And you're going to find that's something of a theme moving forward. So, well, you have the Council of Chalcedon 451, Canon 28. Once again, you have Rome denying Constantinople, which said that it had equal privileges with the Bishop of Rome. And so Rome is once again rejecting one of these sort of canons that Constantinople is sort of slipping in there. Rome is rejecting it. And again, just kind of a nuisance. Like, Rome kind of came and bailed the East out in Constantinople, which is itself a very common theme of this period of history. But okay, so Rome bails us out, but we're still gonna like slip this in there. Oh, wait a minute, Rome actually rejects that. Now, this is like people debate this stuff to no end about whether Rome had the authority to reject it, whether the Eastern bishops recognized it. That's neither here nor there for this particular lecture. The point is that it was a point of contention. It was a point of contention, and it was yet another instance of just Constantinople finding itself upset with Rome. Then we have the Acacian Schism, where Patriarch Acacius of Constantinople issues a compromise document with the Monophysites. Once again, Rome rejects it. Pope Felix III excommunicates Acacius, and this was not actually ended until Pope Hormisdas. And one of the most embarrassing moments for Constantinople, they're forced to sign his agreement of reconciliation, as well as we have the issue surrounding Second Council of Constantinople 553, the issue of where Pope Vigilius is arrested for his refusal to assent to the council. There's, for a good debate on that, go see Ubi Petros and Eric Ibarra's on the Matt Frad channel. They had a good debate around that period of time, and I know they went into Pope Vigilius in some detail. We have the Lateran Council of 649, Pope St. Martin the First at the Lateran, along with Maximus the Confessor, St. Maximus the Confessor, and those two basically going against the entire East once again. We also have the so-called Council of Trullo, an important here because it's one of the first times that Constantinople and the East, we have them sort of holding this little thing together, and it kind of sticks. But Rome, unlike some of the earlier councils of the church, where Rome was like, okay, we don't really like this canon, we don't like this canon, but they're generally accepting of the council as a whole. There's many canons that Rome rejects of Trullo, and it really is not the Constantinople is not very happy about that. We have the iconoclast controversy erupting, where once again Rome is in opposition. Then we have the Phocian Schism, where Patriarch St. Ignatius of Constantinople is wrongly deposed. Patriarch Photius is installed by the emperor, and the papacy intervenes at the behest, mind you, of the parties involved, including Photius. The papacy intervenes and sides with Ignatius, which kind of makes the West, the papacy in particular, a thorn in the side of Photius at this period of time. Okay, so as you can see, it's a rough run of things, and Rome and the quote unquote old Rome, as as I guess they would want to call us, and then the new Rome and all of her grand visions, and here you've got this crabby old Rome over there, and she's constantly like saying, you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do that, we don't accept this, we don't accept that. And you would rather just kind of be done with it to begin with, but there's a lot of prestige with Rome, there's a lot of prestige with the papacy, and when it's useful, we're very quick to turn to Rome, and we're very quick to turn to her decrees and these things. But yeah, when there's a problem, that's when the majority of the time this relationship is it's tenable. It's tenable, and these issues erupt, but you can kind of see it, you can kind of see the direction that it's heading in. And Photius, I think, in some ways was kind of a breaking point. while there had been all of these many problems before between Rome and the Patriarch of Constantinople, this one seemed to have a little bit more staying power in terms of the idea that maybe something isn't quite right here between these brothers. At least I think that's the advantage of hindsight. That's what it looks like in hindsight. They wouldn't have been thinking that at the time, but for me, like trying to look back and say, okay, when do I really want to place where it's like, okay, this is really like leading to something that's inevitably going to end bad. You know, you have two quarreling brothers, and you can sometimes sense that a fight's going to break out. I would pinpoint it at the Phocian schism. And I think rightly in some ways historians are starting to look towards this as being in some sense just as significance as 1054. Even if this one did happen to end in a resolution, it wasn't a full resolution as it left a lot on the table unresolved that would spring up against the Western Church in the coming centuries. But in the meantime, let's see the overall trajectory of the Patriarch of Constantinople leading us up to 1054. So somewhat follows, the same time period. I go back to the 880s, kind of when things are happening as they are in Rome and the other list that we were looking at. But we have, for example, Patriarch Stephen the First. He's a eunuch. He's appointed over Photius. After the whole Phocian conflict, we have St. Anthony the Second. He arbitrates a compromise actually between Photius and St. Ignatius of Constantinople and brings a resolution to that conflict. We have Patriarch Nicholas the First, who is deposed by the emperor, a common theme. Then he's reinstated by the next emperor, another common theme. We have Euthymius, deposed and exiled. We have poor Patriarch Tryphon, deceived into resigning. It's actually kind of a sad story. He was intending to do something good, and it turns out he was actually signing his own resignation. Following him, we have Theophylact, who was made a eunuch so that he could be a prelate and it could be clergy in the Byzantine court. And he made a series of unpopular changes to the divine liturgy, which almost erupted in schism in the city between the imperial powers, which wanted to enforce those reforms, and the sort of old guard of Constantinople, the old conservative who didn't want to have any changes to the divine liturgy. We have Eustathius, who, in a attempt to sort of compromise with Rome, opens a series of Latin churches in the city. And then we have Patriarch Alexius, who himself, in almost anticipation of sort of what's happening in Rome, tries to fight the secular interests. And unfortunately for the patriarchs of Constantinople, they're never able to succeed, nor are the monks. There's a group of monks that for the next several centuries try to break from the what it's a little bit confusing because in Constantinople, the monks that were closely involved with the imperial court were called the independent monks. You would think that they would be the ones that were trying to break free from the empire, but they weren't. I mean, not necessarily from the empire, but at least from the imperial influence. But it wasn't. There was another group of monks who were the actual independent monks who were trying to do something that was not completely dissimilar to what was happening in Cluny, but they were unsuccessful. History would be kind of interesting had Byzantium managed to do that, but it's a different thing when the emperor's in your own city and you're trying to like Rome always had the Mediterranean between itself and the Byzantine Empire, and the patriarchs of Constantinople didn't have that luxury. So when you're reading when we're going to go into this in one of the future lectures, when you're reading about the Patriarch of Constantinople going into, it kind of goes into tailspin by the time that you get to the conquest of the Turks, but it's just one deposition, one exile, one resignation after another. It's almost massive and overwhelming. But the seeds for that are actually it doesn't begin with the Turks. It actually begins with the Byzantine Empire itself. Then we have our man in Amsterdam, Patriarch Michael Cerularius, and I've heard his name pronounced several different ways. I'm going to try to just be consistent in my own pronunciation here and just say Cerularius. This guy has been psychoanalyzed so often. And, I will say one thing right off the bat here before we proceed any further with this lecture. I will say that the Eastern Orthodox have had the wherewithal to not canonize this guy. And as far as I know, there's never really even been like a cult of saint around him, which for us as Catholics is a good thing. We shouldn't necessarily see Cerularius and what he kind of does here as a bar towards reunion, but he's a complicated character who makes a complicated story even more, well, complicated. He's got a very storied life too, even before he becomes patriarch. He is born into a noble family with very powerful civil officials and military leaders. He has very lofty political ambitions. He's sort of trying to rise up the political ladder in Byzantium, which is a very difficult thing to navigate at this time, very dangerous thing to navigate at this time. He's exiled and becomes a monk. Now, much is made of his conversion, questions of whether or not it was genuine, whether it was opportunism, and he does seem to have a little bit of that in him. He's kind of like a career bureaucrat, Not brilliant, but he's loyal to the machine and he's willing to defend the machine to the end. And he comes into the light of history already with grievances against the Latins. He seems to have been a part, at least formed, how much this is, again, like sincere religious convictions and how much this is just him being a bureaucratic representative of Constantinople. It's just impossible to say. But there's a contingent of, it's kind of like a purist movement among the Greeks who, especially in the sort of recent decades, bumping up against the Latins as the Bulgar Slayer, as Basil II conquers these areas, the Byzantines more and more come into contact with Latins in Croatia and Serbia, and more the Greeks are just like incensed by these differences, liturgical or otherwise, that they're finding among the Latins. And so you're starting to see the polemics ramp up a little bit, and he at the very least seems to be influenced by some of those polemics. And again, whether he's just leveraging them or whether it's a sincere conviction, it's difficult to say. So he advances up the ecclesial ladder and becomes patriarch in 1043. And he sees the patriarch in ways not totally dissimilar to the Cluniacs, and in that sense, he's not completely dissimilar to his own predecessor. But, he has ambitions, even though he's friends with Constantine the Ninth, he sort of has these ambitions to thwart Constantine the Ninth's plans. It's kind of an odd thing. But again, I think if you think of Cerularius less as a man who has like friendships and more as a man of like just a bureaucrat, he's loyal to the state apparatus more than he is even to the emperor. And so even though Constantine the Ninth is his friend and Constantine sort of helped him advance up the ladder, it doesn't seem like Cerularius necessarily had any particular convictions to be loyal to the emperor, in particular Constantine. And you're going to find in the next coming slides just these instances where it's like, what is he doing? Why would he do that? Like, you see the emperor like struggling to do this thing, and Cerularius just comes in with like a grenade into the room. But we'll get to that here. So I want to review the just kind of quickly the conflicts of southern Italy that are taking place. We went over this in depth in the last lecture, but just to get you guys caught up again. So we have the Normans. They've successfully invaded most of southern Italy, long associated with Byzantium and a Greek community down there. And the Normans began supplanting the native civil and religious governance with their own. Now, at the same time that all of this is going on, it's when Pope Leo the Ninth has come to the papacy and he's working on his reforms. And while he's, trying to focus on these reforms, this Norman invasion in the south of Italy sort of comes to take over almost all of his concerns because the Normans are pretty awful at what they're doing down there. And so Pope Leo the Ninth sort of sets out to build a coalition to confront the Normans. And this army is unfortunately defeated, and the Pope himself is captured. And while in captivity, he's actively working with Emperor Constantine the Ninth to form an alliance against the Normans to sort of help. This would be like a return return of the brothers here, where there would just be a formal alliance between the papacy and Constantinople against this common enemy. As all of this is going on, as all of this is happening, a letter arrives in southern Italy addressed to the bishops, and most especially to the Bishop of Rome. And this letter is written by Leo of Ohrid. The contents of this letter will ring down for centuries. The bulk of Leo's letter is given to the Azymes controversy, which we will be doing a deep dive into next lecture. Be sure to tune into that one. It's going to be a good one. But he also covers improperly keeping the Sabbath during Lent, improper dietary restrictions. He's got a list of complaints. But I want you to pay close attention to the ending of the letter here. Listen to this quote: "These things, O man of God, having read often with your people, and having taught them thus, and being corrected, order them to change their ways in many similar manners, so that you may gain the salvation of their souls, and announce to the archpriests of the bishops enthroned in Italy, and adjure them to make amends regarding all these, so that you may have the greatest reward, even even you may have among your remaining beautiful things. And if you do this, I will set forth through two writings the greater and bulkier, that is, better developed, of these things, as a clear demonstration of the true and divine faith and teaching and salvation of God of those who, up for themselves to believe beautifully and in accord with right worship, over whom Christ, in due season, has set his very soul." This sounds like Leo of Ohrid is concerned with the salvation of what's essentially the entire Latin Church. He's saying that this is a matter of the salvation of their souls, and that they need to correct these things in order for them to be a part of the body of the church. The implication is that you've already placed yourself, O ye Western man of God, you've placed yourself outside the bark. You and the entire Latin members, clergy and lay alike, are out of the ship, and you'd better fix this grave error to get yourselves back right with the Lord. Leo's letter is very strong in its tone, quite scathing, actually. This letter is received by a Byzantine bishop named John of Trani, who hands it over. Well, he reads it and then hands it over to the Pope's legate in the region, a man named Humbert of Silva Candida. Now let's talk about Humbert. He's a Frenchman, he's a Burgundian, a Benedictine monk. He comes into Bishop Bruno's sphere while in Toul, and in some ways he seems to be not unlike Cerularius himself, which is going to be kind of a problem for us. For us, I mean for the church, for the East and West, because we've got two men that are very similar in some ways, very brash, abrasive, not very given to diplomacy, a little bit hard-headed. There's even some Latins in the same way that you'll find certain Byzantine chroniclers writing about Cerularius and some of his connivances. You've got some Latin authors talking about, especially how Humbert is kind of a hothead, and he's definitely not the guy that you want to send in for negotiations. But he comes to Rome as part of Pope Leo the Ninth's entourage, and he's made cardinal of Silva Candida. And he's among these new reform-minded prelates who are, they're all kind of done acquiescing to the demands of rogues. Now, I'm not saying that Leo of Ulrid was automatically rogue here. He does seem, anyways, if you read his letter, to have been somewhat sincere in his concern over the Azyme issues. It's harder to tell again with Cerularius, but for Leo, he at least seems to have been genuine, if a bit misguided. If there's, I've seen some historians sort of chalk it up to sort of a cranky old man. I don't know. That's kind of hard to psychoanalyze somebody from a millennium away, but be that as it may, Humbert had been dealing with these rogues, secular and religious leaders, left and right, all over the place. I mean, one of the things you got to keep the stuff in mind, the context of all of these things. Where he's working at in southern Italy is right the hot spot of where the Normans are just terrorizing everybody. One of the things that they're dealing with is that there are these Norman knights who were defecting from their own ranks, defecting from the Norman ranks, and they're going on what's effectively a rape and pillage campaign in southern Italy, just terrorizing everybody. It's chaos all over. The population, clergy and lay, is falling apart at the seams. And yet, for some reason, Michael and Leo think, you know what? Now's the time to drop this doozy on the Latins over there. Like, they don't have enough to worry about. They're not preoccupied with something. Let's go ahead and drop this bomb on them. So Humbert is working in Apulia during this time as the papal secretary, and again, he's working to kind of thwart and hold back some of the Norman advances while maintaining a, tenuous hold on the terrorized local population. And then Bishop of John of Trani gives him this letter. Bishop John of Trani himself is one of the Byzantine clergy down in southern Italy, and he hands the letter over as he's instructed to do by Leo of Ulrid in the letter, and then Humbert translates it into Latin and gives it to Pope Leo. Meanwhile, back in Constantinople. Now, originally the Pope had turned to the historic protector of the Holy Roman Empire, but that kind of came to nothing. So in 1053, a delegation went to Constantinople. It was Bishop John of Trani, who we mentioned. It was Argyrus, the military general of the region, and the Patriarch of Venice came along with them. And they began working out a deal with Emperor Constantine, working to solidify an alliance with the papacy. And folks, you have no idea how close, you have no idea how close, instead of a schism, how close we came to possibly having one of the great moments of alliances between the East and West. It's tantalizingly close, and yet, as we know what's going to happen, it wasn't to be. For one thing, Cerularius at the same time is exchanging letters with a man named Nicatis Testathos about the Latin abuses. He's writing these letters back and forth, and they're beginning this actually it's going to be the beginning of a trend of this infamous Byzantine lists of the Latin errors, which continues in some sense down to this very day. And Eastern Orthodox just recently published a two-volume work on the so-called Latin errors. Well, you can trace, Fun trivia fact here. You can trace all that back to this very moment. Even worse, though, he starts shutting down Latin churches in response to Norman aggressions. He's shutting down the Latin churches with the city, including the papal legates. He allows the magistros Nikephoros to remove the Latin Eucharist from the tabernacles and trample them underfoot. He's completely and utterly and wholly opposed to the Latin azymes controversy, which again, I have to save it for next week. But he knows, for example, that the general Argyrus will commune with the Latin host, so he starts refusing this guy who's one of the diplomats there to work on this alliance. He starts refusing him communion. So instead of trying to save the last remaining remnants of the emperor's landed interests in the West, in southern Italy, it seems like Cerularius is doing all that he can do to undermine that. He's had these letters sent to southern Italy. He's kind of sabotaging things that are happening in Constantinople. Now, one of the things that I've come up with in the apologetics is whether or not Cerularius actually had anything to do with Leo's letter. Possibly Leo was just writing this on his own accord. I've seen more and more historians agreeing, though, that that's unlikely. And let's kind of paint the picture here. So you have Basil II, Emperor Basil II demoted the Patriarch of Bulgaria down to an archbishopric. Go into that detail in that last lecture, and then placed all the administrative governance of civil and religious life in Bulgaria in the hands of the empire. Now, Leo of Ohrid, is a Chartoflex in the Hagia Sophia. And this is an extremely important role with the Byzantine Church, and it places him in close proximity to all the imperial religious figures, including the patriarchs of Constantinople of this time. The Chartophylax, he's in charge of the patriarch's correspondence. He's acting as the patriarch's vicar. He had the right to not only answer correspondence in the name of the patriarch, but to also represent him in meetings and synods. So this is an important man in Constantinople. And even if he does end up in Ohrid, because as we noted last time, the Emperor Michael the Fourth appoints him the Archbishop of Bulgaria in 1037. That position is actually under the control of the empire. And when you're under the control of the empire in religious matters, you're pretty much under the control of the Patriarch of Constantinople. So Cerularius has close ties with Constantine the Ninth. After becoming a monk, he himself advances in the court, as we said. So even though Pope Leo the Ninth was potentially an ally with the empire against the Normans, Cerularius begins this campaign against the Latins in the city at this very moment. He also commissions an historian named Ibn Butlan to write a treatise against the Azamites. As well, Humbert's letter to Michael is addressed. Michael, Universal Patriarch of the New Rome, and Leo, Archbishop of the Metropolitanate of Ohrid of the Bulgarians. So, in their minds, in Humbert's minds, and he's writing on behalf of Pope Leo the Ninth, so possibly and most likely Leo the Ninth as well, they see this as this letter that comes to them in southern Italy denouncing their use of azymes and their fasting practices as coming from these two men, not just from Leo. They see Cerularius's hand all over this letter. So he follows Leo's letter with his own as well, Cerularius. Now, this letter is something of an after the fact justification. It's an attempt by Cerularius to exonerate himself from what had just happened in the summer of 1054. So he lists about 20 errors of the Latins, and he even includes his thought that they had been in schism since Vigilius. So he begins the letter. It's a very, very kind of bizarre thing. And it's not something, as far as I'm aware, that the Eastern Orthodox have ever held. I think this is unique to Cerularius's own peculiarities. But he contends that the Pope had been cut off from the church since Pope Vigilius in 555. So for, roughly 500 years, he's saying that the Latin church has been cut off from the whole church. And then he goes on to issue the series of these lists of things that become quite popular in later centuries when they're making these lists. And he begins with the azymes, with the Latins fasting on Saturday, eating unclean foods, having clergy that shave, using pork fat in their foods. They have certain lax practices, he says, during Lent, and that's disputable as well. Most of these are disputable, but anyways, the filioque, he calls that they have different liturgical intonations, and as well that they prohibit priestly marriage. So how does Leo respond to all of this? As you can imagine, he's a little bit preoccupied. Now, we do have two letters. One we're not sure was ever sent. In Terra Pax Hominibus, he responds to the accusations that the Latin use of unleavened bread is heretical, reasserts that Rome is the church with the authority given to it by St. Peter, by Christ. He makes use of the donation of Constantine, which a lot of people, there's a lot of polemics about the donation of Constantine and the so-called papal forgeries and the papal use of these things. I think Catholics have given answers to that, so go search those answers out if you're interested. Leo makes reference of it though, so I'm bringing it up here. It has a more assertive tone, and again, the historians don't quite know if this one was even sent. I've seen quite a few of the historians that say it probably wasn't sent. It's also that it was probably penned by Humbert in Leo's name. The other letter, Scripta Tuae, it's milder in its tone, and we're fairly confident that was the one that was sent. It still asserts Roman primacy. It's an interesting contrast between what Leo sends versus what Cerularius sends, because Leo just doesn't really seem interested in having these sort of theological disputations so much as just kind of asserting the ancient privileges of the Petrine See in these matters. And then not so much to enforce them on the East, but just to like allow for them in the West without being accused of heresy in the process. You don't ever really find the Latins engaging in that kind of silly list making that becomes very popular in the Byzantine East, except for one guy, our friend Humbert. Humbert has a list. Now, much has been made of Humbert's list, and there's some silly accusations in it, like he was notoriously under the assumption that the Byzantines had removed the filioque. But some of the accusations, they're true, actually. While they could have come from a more charitable pen, they could have come maybe from a more diplomatic pen, pastoral. They weren't incorrect, as I've seen some under the impression that they were. So he gives the defense of the Azymes. He accuses Cerularius of simony, accuses them of castration of their clerics. I've seen some people kind of poo-poo that idea, except for the fact that the Byzantine clergy were known to castrate their clerics. It wasn't a universal practice, but it was very common in Constantinople. He accuses them of rejecting the filioque, as I noted. He says that the Greeks are lax in their moral life by allowing married clergy. There's the rejection of the primacy of Rome. He accuses them of rebaptizing Latins, which we do seem to have evidence of that. As well as he says that they are guilty of promoting schism by saying that there's no salvation outside what he rhetorically calls the Church of the Greeks. So some of them are real problems that should have been addressed at some point, but right at this moment, it just doesn't seem like the prudent of all decisions. As someone like myself, desirous of reunion and lamenting the fact that this ever happened, I would have preferred maybe someone who wouldn't have been so triggered and tempted to take the bait as Humbert was. But all right, let's do a rundown here of the timeline of events because this is going to be really helpful for you guys. So if you would follow with me, we have the fall of 1052, the winter of 1053. Letters are being exchanged between Michael Cerularius and Nicatus, as well as letters are being sent to all the patriarchs. In the winter of these sort of hostile polemical letters that are being written by the Patriarch of Constantinople. The winter of 1053, we have Emperor Constantine's governor in southern Italy opening negotiations with Pope Leo IX to form an alliance against the Normans. So the emperor has said, look, I know that Pope Leo is in this fight as well. We should we have this common enemy. We should have this fight together. Winter of 1053 as well, the Normans capture the key Byzantine Apulian towns. Early 1053, the letters of Leo of Ulrid arrive in southern Italy. The letter is handed over to Humbert. March of 1053, Pope Leo returns to Italy with less troops than he had hoped to raise. He wanted to go try to raise troops in the among the Holy Roman Empire and some other places, and he doesn't have much success. Spring, summer of 1053, Cerularius closes the Latin parishes in Constantinople, ostensibly over their use of azymes. Summer of 1053, Humbert pens his Adversus Graecorum calumnies against the calumnies of the Greeks. There's a pamphlet war that's going on at this time that's kind of interesting. We have Humbert and Cerularius sort of exchanging letters. Like I said, it's debated how much of the ones are actually been sent to one another. June 18, 1053, there's the Battle of Civitate, and the Pope is captured. The summer and fall of 1053, Bishop John of Trani, General Argyrus, and the Patriarch of Venice, Dominic, went to Constantinople to convince the emperor and Cerularius to ally with the papacy, and of course Cerularius refuses, again using azymes as the pretext for why he will not join this alliance. Late 1053, Cerularius makes some mild overtures. It's not, nobody's quite sure why he made these overtures at this point. It was possibly at the behest of the emperor. In January of 1054, Leo's letter, the Scripta Tuae, is sent to Cerularius and Leo of Ulrid. 1054, Constantine continues to keep the diplomatic ties with Leo open through Agyrus. Hope for an alliance against the Normans is still quite strong. April 19th, 1054, Pope Leo dies. Sometime in April 1054, the papal legates arrive in Constantinople. So that's sort of the timeline of events leading us up to to the end of this road here. And I want you guys to have that because you kind of need to like have this all how all of these things sort of converge at the moments that they converge and in the timeline that they converge too. All right, so we're getting close. I want to make sure we're all caught up on that timeline. A delegation is formed and it makes its way east. So, what are the papal delegation's intent? Well, you've got among them Cardinal Humbert of Silva Candida, you've got Cardinal Frederick of Lorraine, and you've got the Archbishop Peter of Amalfi. These men are the ones that lead the delegation, and they arrive April 1054. Of course, the most pressing issue is the issue of southern Italy. It's an existential crisis for the papacy at that moment. Leo the Ninth, kind of his last hope is this reunion. He's in captivity. They're seeing it as something of an Armageddon, of an apocalyptic situation. It seems hopeful, though. The delegation reports that the meetings are productive, as do our Byzantine sources. The delegation is warmly met by the Emperor Constantine upon arrival. The meetings go well, everything's going fine. Unfortunately, all throughout this, Cerularius is refusing to meet with the legates. And for reasons uncertain, historians don't there's no like unified agreement of why Cerularius does this at this moment. I've heard a few different disputes, this could have been his moment to shine. He's had all of these issues with these men. They're here now. Let's have a public dispute. The legates were itching to meet him. They needed this alliance. Was he trying to avoid them to allow the emperor a chance to work his negotiations? Well, that seems unlikely because there's a flurry of letters that are exchanged with one another. And then given his like known temperament, an attitude towards the Romans. But B, he writes this letter to Peter of Antioch later that though the papal delegates were actually, he thought that the papal delegates were actually agents of Argyrus, the general whom he had refused to commune on his last trip there. So he's kind of claiming later to Patriarch Peter III of Antioch that he says, I look, I made an honest mistake. So make of it what you will. But the fact is that the entire thing stalls. April turns to May, May turns to June, June to July. The letters between Humbert and Cerularius become more tense, more polemical. The whole thing really begins to deteriorate. The emperor, he does try to intervene, but Cerularius just won't budge. And then sometime in early July, Humbert drafts a bull of excommunication. Then on July 16th, 1054, after 100 days of waiting in Constantinople, after what should have been a relatively quick diplomatic trip to make an alliance that could have forged a century-long bond between East and West, instead, Humbert walks into the Hagia Sophia and drops the bull of excommunication. Included in the excommunication is the Patriarch Michael Cerularius, Leo of Ulrid, and their followers, and then they left the city. And months later, Michael Cerularius drafts his own bull of excommunication. We look back on events like those that happened at 1054 as inevitable. And while all things certainly are within God's providence, the mistakes are our own. Hopefully, if nothing else, you realize over the course of these last two lectures that this wasn't inevitable, and that at several points, had men's heart not been so hardened, this may have never happened, at least not at that moment, at least not so permanently. In fact, as I said, we were enticingly close to forging a very substantial and possibly long-lasting alliance. Now, fortunately, in our own times, on December 7th, 1965, the two excommunications were lifted. Rome lifted its excommunications, as did the Patriarch of Constantinople. And the church began to make serious inroads towards reconciliation. As I see it, our goal is to not let men like the ones all those centuries ago win the day, to instead help let cooler heads prevail, and in time, Lord willing, see more and more images like the ones we see here. I hope you enjoyed these lectures. If you enjoyed this particular one, please like the video, subscribe to the channel. Tune in next time, we'll be covering the Azymes controversy. Did the Orthodox Church concede the debate? I'll see you all then. God bless.